Hi there, hope you're having a pleasant day wherever you may be. Right now, I'm looking at the largest of the oldest. That's right, I'm at the Patriarch Grove of the Ancient Bristlecone Pine Forest. The Patriarch Grove is located about 12 miles north of the Schulman Grove, which is the main visitor center of the Ancient Bristlecone Pine Forest, which itself is about 20 or so miles into the White Mountains outside of Big Pine. So what exactly is the Patriarch Grove? Well, it's one of two groves of ancient bristlecone pines found here in the White Mountains. Now these are a species of tree that are known for their longevity and are actually considered the oldest living organisms on the planet. Now of the two groves, it's actually the Schulman Grove that has the older trees, and for those of you that have been playing along at home, you might remember that I visited there a couple years ago on my US 395 video, so if you'd like to check that out, go right ahead. But what do you say when we get back to this one? The ancient bristlecone pine, which is the Great Basin bristlecone pine here in the White Mountains, is known for its ability to live in very harsh environments. For instance, it grows between 9 and 11,000 feet, and here in the White Mountains it's very rocky and alkaline-rich soil that not a lot of things can grow in. And it's that ability to live in the harsh environment combined with not really having much competition that allows them to live as long as they do. Here at the Patriarch Grove, the trees tend to be a little larger than the Schulman Grove, and one would easily assume that larger trees equals older trees, but not when it comes to bristlecone pines. It's actually the smaller ones that are more resilient and actually live a lot longer. The smaller, more slow-growing trees tend to have a harder wood that allows them to deal with the harsh elements a lot better than the younger, softer wood trees, which tend to not deal with it as well, and subsequently don't live as long. Now, living in harsh conditions does have a couple of advantages. One of them is there's not a lot of competition for the few nutrients that are in the soil. And two, there's not a lot of other shrubbery and things around it to catch fires, so they're not as prone to forest fires and things like that. Now, that's not to say that they're immune. There is some of them that look like they have been struck by lightning or have dealt with some sort of fire. Now what's really cool is that they are so slow growing that the elements like the wind and things like that tend to twist them into these weird shapes like something out of a Tim Burton movie. They're really cool to look at. They also have a pretty good ability to adapt. Like their root system extends out pretty far, and if one part gets kind of exposed and doesn't get the nutrients it needs, that part of the tree dies and the rest of it continues on. And a lot of times the bark is almost entirely stripped away, upwards of 90% in some cases. And typically other types of trees would not be able to survive that lack of bark, but the bristlecone pine survives, and a narrow strip can keep it nourished. So as a result, as you're walking around, a lot of these trees look like they're dead, but you can walk around to the other side and you'll see some pine needles and you'll realize, no, this tree is not dead. It's still persevering, it's still surviving. Now, conditions are harsh here in the White Mountains, and sometimes the bristlecone pine needs a little bit of help. So there's some types of birds that will bury caches of seeds and things like that to feed on them later, and they forget about them, and they inadvertently plant a bristlecone pine, which is what happened here. Now, according to the kiosk here, this is actually 5 trees sort of combined. That doesn't seem to be an uncommon trait among bristlecone pines, where multiple trees sort of fuse together into one big one. Now, if you were wondering where the bristlecone pine gets its name, look no further than its pine cone. It's typically purple with little spikes or bristles sticking out of it at the end of branches with their pine needles, which are in the shape of a foxtail. Now, what's interesting about the pine needles of the bristlecone pine is that typical pine trees tend to shed their needles every few years. These shed every 40 years, which also adds to its longevity. The Patriarch Grove sits at about 11,000 feet, which is about 1,000 or so feet higher than the Schulman Grove, and more or less represents the tree line, which means that trees will not grow any higher than this. Now, the main factor determining that is temperature. Now, higher up on the mountain are the remnants of dead trees that are believed to have died about 2,000 years ago, indicating a cooling trend. Now, there's currently Younger trees that are creeping up a little higher than the current tree line, indicating that the warming temperatures are making it suitable for them to grow at that higher elevation again. Speaking of lower temperatures, it is believed that millions of years ago there were much larger groves of these trees, but the most recent ice age, about 12,000 years ago, caused them to retreat up into small pockets throughout the Great Basin area. Another really cool thing about the ancient bristlecone pine is that they helped rewrite human history. Now, everybody knows that the tree rings can be used to determine the age of a tree, but they actually tell you a lot more. They can tell you what weather conditions were like, temperature conditions, and they can all determine that from the tree rings. Radiocarbon dating is a method that scientists have used to date certain things, and back in the 1960s, they realized that it was flawed and needed to be sort of calibrated. And that's where the bristlecone pine comes into play. They were able to take core samples of living and dead trees and match them up based on the way the rings grew. And by overlapping them with the dead trees, they were able to get a pretty good picture of up to 12,000 years ago. And using the tree samples, they were able to recalibrate the radiocarbon dating, which in turn adjusted the time periods that they thought certain human actions had taken place and totally rewrote history in that regard. Pretty cool, right? Speaking of tree rings, they don't grow in concentric circles like a typical tree does. Instead, because the bristlecone pine is so adaptable and will allow parts of itself to die off for the betterment of the tree, they tend to grow asymmetrically. So when a part dies off, they stop growing, but they'll continue growing on the part of the tree that is still alive. For instance, this tree fell over, but maintained enough of a root system to keep living to some degree. And you can see part of the pine needle still going strong. There are a couple of trails here. There's the Timberline Ancients Trail and there's the Cottonwood Basin Overlook Trail. Now what's interesting is that the Timberline Trail is sort of sheltered by the mountains, so the trees appear to be more upright and less contorted, where the Cottonwood Basin Overlook Trail is a little bit more on the slope of the mountain. So they're more exposed to the elements, more exposed to the wind and harsh conditions. So the trees subsequently seem a lot more contorted. They seem a lot more, in their weird shapes, and they look like the typical bristlecone pine. So now this here is the namesake of the Patriarch Grove. This is the Patriarch tree. It was discovered in 1948 and is believed to be the largest of the ancient bristlecone pines. It measures about 38 feet around at the base. And if you remember, I said that the larger trees don't necessarily mean the older trees. So this one is actually believed to be about 1,500 years old, so far from the oldest one. So to visit the Patriarch Grove, first you got to pass the Schulman Grove, which is actually the main part of the ancient bristlecone pine forest. It's a paved road all the way up to it. It includes a visitor center, has a couple of trails, and includes a trail to the oldest trees. Now the Patriarch Grove is a kind of a big step further. It's only 12 miles from the Schulman Grove, but it's a rough 12 miles. It takes about an hour to drive that. It's primarily a dirt road. Some of it's kind of rough. It's washboarded in a couple spots, but I'm not so much concerned about the washboard as I am sort of the sharp rocks. As a matter of fact, as soon as you hit the road, it says, there's no AAA here, make sure your spare is good, and watch out for sharp rocks. It warns you. So I was a little scared driving up here, a little scared driving back, to be honest, but yeah, just something to keep in mind. Once you do get here, there is a little parking area, there's a bathroom, pit toilet, of course. There's two trails that are relatively short, but very interesting. You get some nice views. Surprisingly, there's cell phone service here. As a matter of fact, driving up to Schulman Grove, there's really no service at all. But once you get past going to Patriarch Grove, there's actually decent cell service for a good chunk of the drive, and then even when you get here, so go figure, right? This one definitely is more off the beaten path than the main visitor center at Schulman Grove. So it hasn't been super crowded. There's been a few times where there was about 5 cars here, but everybody kind of kept to themselves, and it's been a pretty pleasant time here. Now it's worth noting again, I know I mentioned it the last time I was here, but these trees being as old as they are, they've lived here for upwards of thousands of years, especially down by the Schulman Grove with the Methuselah tree. It's just amazing to think of how many empires have risen and fallen, how many people have lived and died, how many heroes have been made and martyrs. It's just interesting to know that while all that was going on in human history, these trees were here, you know, living steadfastly. It's just an amazing thing. Well, that does it for this one. Thanks for joining me on this trip to the Patriarch Grove of the Ancient Bristlecone Pines. I hope you found it interesting, hope you found it entertaining, and I hope it encouraged you to come check it out. At least check out the Schulman Grove. With that said, I guess I'll see you on the next one. Interesting little tidbit is that if hiking's not your thing, Patriarch tree, right next to the parking lot.